I'm Janet Silver. In just over 2 weeks, MPs will head back to their ridings as Parliament takes its winter break. Government House Leader Mark Holland says his government has a, quote, very ambitious agenda, introducing bills in both chambers. As we count down to Christmas, what are some of the priorities for the government in the days ahead? And joining me now to break this all down are two experienced political operatives and my colleagues here at Syntax, Jon Dugal and Jake Enwright. And Jake, I'm going to start with you because on our last podcast, we began talking about the fall economic statement. Traditionally, is there a deadline as to when that needs to pass as we look ahead to Christmas?
Traditionally, it wasn't a government announcement that required legislative implementation, but it has so become under this government, and they treat it more like a budget implementation act. Ideally, for the government, they'd want it passed for Christmas so they can spend all of January talking about it with their constituents. However, I think if the Conservatives are successful in holding up the implementation of the fall economic statement, I think that message suffices well enough for the government to talk to Canadians for 6-7 weeks in January about how the Conservatives are holding up the country's economic recovery and support for people struggling to make ends meet.
So, John, picking up on that, if they're trying to get the fall economic statement passed and done before Christmas, are there other key priorities along with the fall economic statement that the government wants to see done and completed before they take their break?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even within the fall economic statement, let's just break it out a little bit because there were a couple moving pieces there in terms of even the affordability lens. There's affordability in terms of the more direct cash type affordability through increases to the GST that have passed, through a one-time housing benefit that's going to pass, the dental care benefit, which as we're recording this, the Prime Minister is making his announcement today, and the ministers are fanning out across the country to make their announcements. And they're actually launching the dental portal today so that families who are earning under $90,000 and have children under 12, they'll be able to go out and apply under that portal now and start receiving the dental benefit moving forward. Outside of that, though, if you really look at some of the government activities right now, and certainly the public conversation, what we're definitely seeing is a renewed focus on healthcare, right? Because the Bloc is putting it in the window. They have a private member's bill on the floor of the House of Commons that would call for increases to the Canada Health Transfer. The Minister of Health met a few weeks ago with provincial ministers out in Victoria or Vancouver for the Health Ministers Summit and ended up having to walk away, leaving the table because it was pretty adamant and pretty clear that the provincial ministers weren't there really to get down to business and find an agreement on something that they actually seem to have a lot of pan-Canadian support or actual cross-ministry agreement on, especially around things like health data and pieces like that. But the premiers are very much walking the line of the health ministers are very much walking the line of their premiers right now, which is we want unconditional transfers to the Canada Health or unconditional increases to the Canada Health Transfer. That's not going to come anytime soon based on the federal government's posturing. They want that data agreement in place so that we have a better sense of actually what's going on in the country when it comes to the determinants of health and the actual health of Canadians. So that very much seems to be a real priority to this federal government. And I think we're going to see some steps here in the next few months, whether it is on the Canada Health Transfer actually being increased and a data strategy coming out, if the ministers can really get down to brass tacks on that. And then we'll also see some other monies thrown into the window, I believe, a bit more targeted, definitely strings attached money going towards the health transfers, because of course, the federal government did put some more money into that over the last few years with COVID, and they've shown a willingness to do so moving forward as well.
You said something though, you said strings attached, which is exactly what the provinces don't want, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, no province in their right mind is realistically going to look at a couple $2 billion in the window for doctors and nurses and new care beds or reducing backlogs of surgeries and wait times, et cetera, and say, actually, I'm not going to take that money. They'll take the money when it's there, and especially when it's paired with that potential increase to the Canada Health Transfer with the data agreement. The federal government is certainly banking on that.
This is a debate and a conflict point that was more traditionally held within conservative circles. Conservatives historically have been very apprehensive toward handing over money to the provinces, whether it's healthcare or otherwise, without those strings attached. So it's amusing to me to see this conversation start to be dominated among Liberals these days.
Speaking of Liberals, I want to go back to something that I said in the intro to this podcast with regards to Government House Leader Mark Holland. He told the Hill Times last month that his government was introducing more bills in the Senate as a tool to get their legislative agenda through both houses because the House is so dysfunctional. And I'm just wondering, and I'll get this from both of you, whether or not that's good politics. And if the House is that dysfunctional, what does that mean in terms of trying to get some of these other priorities passed for the government?
Take a stab at that first. And I hate to give you a double answer, but it's good and bad politics. It's bad politics because anything that involves the Senate is bad. The Senate is an archaic, undemocratic, corrupt institution, and it should be turned into the world's largest Tim Hortons. It's already red. It's good, Paul. It's no, I said bad. Actually, you know what? It's all bad. It's bad politics. Anything involved in the Senate is bad. It's also a dumb idea to take stuff through the Senate. Why? The Senate has the rules of the Senate, the procedural rules make it easier for conservative senators to hold up legislation indefinitely. One senator can halt legislation in its tracks versus when legislation is going through the House of Commons, the government can invoke closure. I don't buy that argument. Their government is effectively operating in a coalition with the NDP. It can use closure at any time to move any agenda item through the House of Commons. If they put it through the Senate, conservative senators will hold it up very easily if they so want to.
Jon?
I'll get back to you guys in a second here. I'm just texting Jagmeet Singh to let him know I just found his senior advisor on Senate issues, because that sounds a lot like an NDP position in abolishing the Senate.
Probably Justin Trudeau's greatest legacy, that he made the Senate a laughing stock by appointing all of his quote unquote independent senators.
Not wrong there. And I mean, I got to agree with Jake. It's mostly bad. There's certainly some good here for the government, but bad because it gives the opposition more opportunity, right? In the sense that you can now say you are moving outside of the parameters of traditional parliament or procedure, or you are trying to stifle debate in the House of Commons. You are trying to stifle the debate of the elected officials, the ones that are actually accountable back to the people that elected them in the first place. And they can, so the opposition is going to be able to hammer them if they want to over this. Then again, it's a non-issue for most Canadians. It's good politics for the government because the government can look at Canadians and say, look at how much we're getting done, or look how much we're trying to get done. In the face of all the obfuscation, all the opposition, we are taking steps to actually get it done for Canadians. So in that sense, it's good. Probably more bad in terms of what narrative would play out in terms of interest to Canadians.
Such an obvious trap. No conservative senator would fall into such an obvious trap, right?
Yeah.
No, that won't happen. Okay. You're right, actually. And that you stole the, I was trying to think to myself while you're talking, why did I think it was good? And you hit the nail on the head, Jon. It's good because conservatives will fall into the trap. They will hold up. There'll be some very central piece of the government's agenda that they move through the Senate, and some conservative senator will hold it up, and they will walk around the country for the next 8 weeks saying that conservatives are holding up X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. You're bang on.
Just to switch gears a little bit before we go, I would be remiss if we didn't touch on what's going on in Alberta and the Sovereignty Act. The premier of that province says the proposed law is necessary to protect Albertans from overreach by the federal government. And I'm just wondering, when you look at all the reasonings for this coming out of Alberta from the government there as to why they need the Sovereignty Act, I'm wondering, and maybe this is oversimplification, Jake, but is this really about the oil and gas sector?
No, it's mostly about regionalism, and it's mostly about an age-old question that has dominated political discourse for over 300 years in Western democracies, and that's, where does the residual power lie? And there's lots of people in this country, and there's lots of politicians who wish the Dominion of Canada operated more like the United States, where the powers and the residual powers lied with the state and not the federal government. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way here. You'd have to rewind all the way back to the JCPC, the Judicial Committee, the Judicial Council, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council that used to operate as Canada's Supreme Court before 1949. So I think, I think Ms. Smith is living in the past. I think she's playing a game that will probably only lead to chaos and further ideological separation of mainstream politicians, something that both in the United States and Canada voters are rejecting en masse these days.
Jon, your thoughts?
Well, let's assume for a second that the lieutenant governor even signs the bill into law, right? And that is a bit of an assumption still, because I mean, by convention, they typically would, but in a the historical context, Alberta has actually been one of the cases where a lieutenant governor has actually refused to sign a bill into law, and based on the grounds of constitutionality. So that being in the window, the lieutenant governor actually, I was reading this the other day, does have the opportunity to actually ask for a reference or for a secondary opinion, for example, from the Governor General of Canada, Mary Simon in this case. So maybe that's going to play out. But let's say it does get signed into law, then there seems to be a couple of potential avenues that could go down here in terms of conflict around the bill itself being signed into law. The first one, and probably the most nuclear, would be if the federal government were to immediately step in and ask the Supreme Court for a reference. They certainly are not seeming to indicate that they will. They've had preliminary briefings on constitutionality around it, or at least around the bill itself so far. And so they're very much holding pattern for right now, and almost to a fault in the way that they were in relation to Quebec around the niqab ban, et cetera. Versus in Ontario recently, you saw the federal government come out very strong and very heavy-handed in its commentary around the invocation of the notwithstanding clause in that context. So definitely one set of rules for Ontario, another set of rules for everyone else in this situation. Let's call a spade a spade. But assuming the federal government doesn't want to go down the nuclear option, the provincial government, before even trying to pass a law, could seemingly ask for a reference as well, or even after it does pass a law, it could ask for a reference from the Supreme Court to, or even from a more friendly court, whether it's the Court of King's Bench or the Alberta Court of Appeal. They could ask for that reference to underscore the constitutionality of it before it does get challenged. So that option is definitely there for them, and it would be more of a defensive play for them, in my opinion. And I guess as well, just being out in front of the issue. And the third option would potentially be if a civil society group, for example, wants to gum this thing up in the courts, and as soon as it's passed, they challenge it in the court system. And then you could see yourself in a constitutional fight going all the way up to Supreme Court. So there's plenty of options.
I don't think it's going to make it. If this thing ends up in the courts, I don't think, I mean, other than optics, and I'm no legal expert, other than the optics, given the gravity of the legislation, the fact that it involves a province and a premier, I wouldn't understand why this thing wouldn't be struck down by a lower court and the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it. Jurisdiction it has long been settled through not only convention and the residual power, but through various precedents set by the court and court action. So this isn't, a conversation about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is relatively new in Canadian political history. This is a conversation about something that goes right back to the founding of the Dominion of Canada, and it's well settled. I think if anybody wants to understand what is going on here, I would encourage them to read something called the Laurentian Thesis. The Laurentian Thesis talks about how the natural political divide between Canada and the United States came along the 49th parallel, but culturally, the dividing lines actually run north-south, and that's why you have, Vancouver is much more like LA, Calgary is much more like Montana, Ontario and Quebec are much more like New York, the Maritimes are like Boston. The natural cultural lines divide.
Atlantic Canada? What about Newfoundland?
I'm going to include Newfoundland in there. I'm always a big believer that Newfoundland is Atlantic Canada. I refuse to believe otherwise. Mm-hmm. And I know that offends a lot of people. I would actually, but culturally, you find them all very similar. And I think, as we enter an era of political cultural instability, you're seeing that political cultural instability in Western provinces more so because it exists also in the Western, the flyover states of the United States. It's very similar there as well. And that's why this is happening. That cultural bleed over is happening for that reason in this context. I think that's a very appropriate the argument to go back and review if you want to understand how we've gotten here.
Yeah, totally. And even with relation to just the content or even just the framing of the bill itself in Alberta. I mean, Jake, we were talking about this the other day. Danielle Smith seems to be an expert in this case of promising one thing to the base to get elected as leader, and then very much coming forward with something that's watered down and more maybe appealing to the broader public in Alberta, less so outside of it, but still something that is different than what was originally proposed in that context.
I don't understand. And admittedly, I'm not from there, and someone from Alberta would say that this is why you don't understand. But I don't understand how Ms. Smith believes that this act is going to differentiate herself from Rachel Notley in the next election. I think rightly or wrongly, objectively, one could argue that Ms. Notley did a fairly good job standing up for the interests of Albertans. A lot of the criticism that I remember from the time she was in office had to do with the provincial politics and provincial policy making that affected Albertans specifically, not how Alberta operated within inside Confederation. In fact, she was so adamant about the need to support the oil and gas sector, build pipelines to get our product to foreign markets, that she's had a falling out with Jagmeet Singh. And so the federal NDP who want to shut the whole thing down. So I'm not sure this is creating the contrast that Ms. Smith thinks it's going to. And I think it's just going to create a persona around her as a chaotic ideological politician that, again, both Canadians and Americans seem to be rejecting en masse.
I'm sure we'll pick this up again next spring when that election happens in Alberta. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you to my colleagues, Jon Dugal and Jake Enwright. I'm Janet Silver. Till next time.